Some mysteries are born not in darkness, but in the fog that clouds the human heart. This tale begins on a night when London lay smothered in mist, and a series of ominous symbols drew Holmes and Watson into a web of jealousy, secrecy, and sudden death. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour is upon us, and the case unfolds. Let us step into the fog together. London lay beneath a pall of fog so thick and unyielding that even the familiar outline of Baker Street seemed dissolved into shadow. It was one of those evenings when the very lamps appeared as dim, swollen orbs, their glow smothered before it could reach the cobbles. The air was heavy, chill, and damp, clinging to one's garments and dulling every sound save for the occasional rattle of a carriage or the distant cry of a street hawker muffled by the haze. I recall sitting at our window and gazing out into that spectral shroud, struck by the sense that the world beyond was strangely suspended, a theatre whose scenery had been veiled until the moment of revelation. To my medical mind, such weather seemed a kind of suffocation of the city, stifling vitality and weighing upon the spirit. Yet within me it also bred a nervous expectancy, as though the fog itself conspired to conceal dark movements and untold designs. Holmes, ever unmoved by outward conditions, sat quietly with his pipe, the smoke curling upward and vanishing as though to join the ghostly atmosphere outside. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional shifting of the embers in our grate. It was at such moments that I felt most strongly the curious contrast between the ordinary tranquillity of our rooms and the extraordinary dramas that so often began with some interruption at that very door. And so, as the fog pressed more closely against the glass, I felt certain that some new chapter of adventure was even then approaching. Inside, however, the gloom of London yielded to a scene of homely comfort. The fire burned with a steady glow, sending out waves of warmth that softened the damp chill clinging to my coat. Holmes sat opposite me in his well-worn armchair, his long, spare frame composed with that curious stillness which concealed such latent energy. His eyes, half veiled beneath lowered lids, fixed themselves upon the dancing flames, yet I knew from long habit that his mind was anything but idle. The ticking of the mantel clock, the faint hiss of the coal, and the fragrance of strong tobacco blended into a calm that might have deceived a stranger into believing that all the world beyond was equally at peace. I alone recognized in that very calm the harbinger of sudden action, for in Baker Street, serenity was but the interval between storms. The stillness was broken at length by the faint scrape of a boot upon the stair. My ear, trained by many such evenings, distinguished at once the uneven cadence of one who paused often, as though uncertain of his welcome. I glanced toward Holmes, but he gave no sign of having heard, though I felt sure that not the faintest sound escaped him. Presently, there came a hesitant rapping at our door, so soft that it might easily have passed unnoticed amid the noise of ordinary life. In that hushed hour, however, it carried an air of foreboding. I confess my pulse quickened, for I have learned to associate such hesitant summonses with the gravest of affairs. Holmes rose not at once, but with deliberate leisure, drawing the moment out until the silence grew oppressive. Then, with a swift glance toward me, he moved across the room and placed his hand upon the knob. It seemed to me that even before the portal swung wide, he already possessed knowledge of the figure waiting beyond. "Before we admit our visitor, Watson," Holmes remarked in his low, even tone, "permit me to sketch him for you." His hand rested lightly upon the door, his head inclined as if to catch vibrations too delicate for my ears. "He is a man of learning," he continued, "yet of recent strain. His step falters upon the left foot, not from infirmity but from hesitation, as though uncertain whether to intrude. The sound of damp cloth betrays exposure to the evening fog, and there is the faint scrape of metal at his side, which I take to be a watch chain of modest manufacture. A barrister, I think, judging from the measured pacing upon the stair and the pause before each tread, the rhythm of one accustomed to weighing arguments. I listened in growing astonishment, for indeed nothing but the faintest echoes had reached me through the panels. Holmes's eyes gleamed for a moment in the dim light. He is young, troubled, and in haste to be rid of some burden. You shall see, Watson, that his very countenance will corroborate the rest. With that, he turned the handle, and I, in spite of long familiarity with his marvellous faculty of observation, found myself leaning forward in a state of profound curiosity to behold the living proof of his words. The door opened upon a young man whose pale features bore the unmistakable stamp of anxiety. His dark hair clung damply to his forehead, and his eyes, restless and uncertain, glanced quickly from Holmes to myself before settling in mute appeal upon my companion. His attire, though carefully chosen, was disordered by haste, and the faint chain of a watch glimmered exactly where Holmes had foretold. I could not restrain an exclamation, for the accuracy of Holmes's delineation was once more complete. The young man advanced a step into the glow of our sitting room, and with that motion there seemed to pass into the very air a charge of suspense, as though his presence carried with it the shadow of peril yet unrevealed. Holmes bowed gravely and motioned him to a chair. "Pray compose yourself, sir," said he. "You have come to Baker Street for a purpose. Let us hear it without delay." The young man whom Holmes had so unerringly described stood for a moment upon the threshold, his breath quickened, as though he had hastened through the choking mists. His countenance bore that strained look of one pursued not by visible foes, but by shadows of his own imagining. The fog seemed to have clung to his garments, for a damp chill accompanied him into our rooms, and I thought I discerned in his eyes the hunted expression of one long oppressed by secrecy. With an inclination of his head, Holmes motioned him toward the chair by the fire. The stranger obeyed with nervous eagerness, though he cast one furtive glance at the window as if fearing some phantom presence in the street below. I had seen men enter Baker Street in many states of agitation, yet rarely with such mingled dread and urgency. Even before he spoke, I perceived that his errand was weighted with peril both personal and obscure. Holmes, in his most tranquil manner, regarded him steadily, waiting for the silence to grow so that the young man might feel compelled to unburden himself. The atmosphere of fog and firelight enclosed us, and the stage was set for his tale. "My name is Lionel Ashcroft," said he at last, with an effort to master his agitation. His voice, though refined, faltered upon the syllables, betraying the strain under which he laboured. He was, as Holmes had already foretold, a barrister of the Temple, and his bearing, despite his evident distress, carried the unmistakable air of legal training. The measured tone, the cautious phrasing, and the habit of deliberate gesture. His face was pale, the pallor exaggerated by the dark fog-wet hair that clung to his brow. The neatness of his attire was marred by haste, his gloves still clutched in one hand, as if he had run without pause from chambers to carriage. He seemed a man torn between dignity and desperation, striving to maintain composure while some unseen weight pressed heavily upon him. Holmes inclined his head courteously, bidding him proceed. "I come, Mr. Holmes," said Ashcroft, leaning forward with clasped hands, "under a pressure which no man of reason could long endure. For some weeks past, I have discovered, in my chambers at the Temple, certain papers placed there by no hand of mine. They are brief, but sinister. Each bears but a few words, warnings, threats, and at times mere symbols. Yet everyone is signed by the crude impression of a dagger, drawn in dark ink upon the page." He drew from his pocket a folded sheet, which Holmes accepted with delicate fingers. Upon it I saw the rough outline of a blade, beneath which was scrawled the phrase, "You are not safe." The letters were jagged, as though traced in haste or passion, and the effect was uncommonly disquieting. Ashcroft continued, his voice dropping lower. "These messages appear without witness. My clerks are loyal, my servants trustworthy, yet the notes materialize as if conjured from the very air. Each morning I dread to find one, and each morning I am not disappointed. They do not menace me alone. Their phrasing implies calamity for those about me. His hands trembled as he replaced the paper, and I perceived that this man's courage was already worn to threads. "It is not myself I chiefly fear for, gentlemen," said Ashcroft, after a pause in which his features worked with evident emotion. "Were these warnings directed solely at my own person, I might meet them with the fortitude expected of one of my calling. But the shadow they cast extends beyond me. I have but one sister, Miss Evelyn Ashcroft, and she has lately become engaged to Sir Edmund Vale." At the mention of the name, Holmes gave a scarcely perceptible start, though his expression remained serene. "You will know of him," Ashcroft continued hurriedly. "He is an industrial magnate, prominent in commerce, and a man not without enemies. Yet the tone of these threats convinces me that it is not Vale, but my sister who is the intended victim. Imagine, if you can, the torment of a brother who sees danger hovering yet cannot seize the hand that strikes. Each night I ask myself whether she is already marked for ruin." He fell silent, his lips pressed tight, as if to restrain further outburst. His agitation was so genuine that my own sympathy was deeply stirred. Holmes, however, remained composed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he prepared to question further. "You have kept these matters, Mr. Ashcroft, from the police?" Holmes inquired in a tone neither reproachful nor approving, but coldly practical. "I have," the barrister admitted. "I feared ridicule and delay. I believed you alone might pierce the mystery." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "Describe to me, if you please, the circumstances under which each note was found. Were the doors secured, the windows locked? Did any servant or clerk have opportunity for entry?" Ashcroft answered with rapid detail, his voice betraying the relief of one at last permitted to disclose a burden. Yet in his recital I detected, as did Holmes, a few slight contradictions. A key left unturned one night, a clerk dismissed earlier than usual on another. Holmes made no comment, but his gaze rested keenly upon the young man's shifting hands and restless glance. He asked brief questions, each striking to the heart of the matter, until Ashcroft sat visibly shaken under the quiet precision of the examination. "Very good," said Holmes at last, leaning back. "You have given me much to consider. And now, what is it you most desire from me?" Ashcroft clasped his hands more tightly, as if the very strength of his plea might compel our assistance. "It is not mere protection I seek, Mr. Holmes. Were it only that, I might engage watchmen or appeal to the law. What I ask is far more vital. I would know the mind that lies behind these warnings. Who is it that pursues me thus? What madness or malice guides his hand? To shield my sister, I must first understand the danger in its essence." His words, though halting, rang with sincerity, and I confess they touched me deeply. I saw in his pale countenance the reflection of a soul haunted, not by physical peril alone, but by the spectre of an intelligence bent upon his ruin. Holmes rose slowly, his eyes gleaming with that light I had come to recognize as the herald of inquiry. "You shall have your answer, Mr. Ashcroft," he said, "but answers are not won without effort. You must be prepared for revelations more disquieting than the threats themselves." The barrister bowed his head, as one resigned to any cost. And thus, in that fog-dimmed evening, the case began in earnest. That same evening found us seated within a hansom, bound for the Temple, with Mr. Lionel Ashcroft opposite and Holmes by my side. The fog still hung heavily over the city, so that the familiar outlines of Westminster and Fleet Street were reduced to dim silhouettes, looming and receding like phantoms. The horses' hooves struck the stones with muffled resonance, and at times the driver's lantern was little more than a blurred halo drifting before us. Ashcroft sat in uneasy silence, his fingers continually tightening upon the handle of his umbrella. His pale features, lit faintly by the passing lamps, betrayed a torment which words had not yet relieved. Holmes, meanwhile, leaned back in quiet repose, his eyes half closed, but his faculties, I knew, keenly alert. Thus we travelled through the spectral avenues of London, the city itself seeming to share in the mystery that pressed upon our companion. At length we alighted at the temple, where the sombre bulk of ancient buildings loomed above the fog like grey sentinels of the law. Ashcroft led us quickly to his chambers, the echo of our steps resounding strangely in the deserted court. The porter, drowsing by the entrance, scarcely stirred as we passed, and in a few minutes we stood within Ashcroft's rooms. The place bore the ordered appearance of a man of study, shelves well stocked with volumes, a desk strewn with briefs and notes, and the lingering odour of sealing wax. Yet upon Holmes's entrance, the atmosphere seemed to shift, as though some unseen presence had been disturbed. Without word or hesitation, my friend passed immediately from corner to corner, examining each article with a minuteness that rendered Ashcroft restless and myself filled with admiration. His keen eyes noted what mine entirely overlooked: the smallest impressions, the faintest residues. The barrister, meanwhile, wrung his hands in nervous expectation, as if dreading what the investigation might reveal. Holmes halted presently by the window, upon which the fog pressed with clammy fingers. "Observe, Watson," said he, pointing with the stem of his pipe. Upon the wooden sill, where the curtain barely covered the recess, lay a few pale spots hardened into globules. To my sight they were insignificant, but Holmes's gaze rested upon them with evident satisfaction. "Candle, wax," he murmured. "See how it has run in a slight incline. This is not the trace of a casual accident, but of a candle set deliberately in this very position. One would not choose such a perch unless he wished the light to fall without the chamber, and not within it." Ashcroft started, his face paling further. "Then someone has watched?" he whispered. "Watched, yes," Holmes replied quietly, "and from without, not within. The shadow of our adversary grows clearer." Holmes next knelt upon the boards near the door, his long fingers brushing delicately along the cracks. When he rose, his hand bore a faint smear of black. "Coal soot," said he. "Yet your fires have not been lit of late, Mr. Ashcroft. And here, Watson, note this patch of darker hue. It is damp, as though from the brushing of a heavy garment that had been out in the night air." I stooped and indeed perceived the acrid odour of wet wool mingled with the soot. A cloak, perhaps, had left its trace there, shaken by one who entered stealthily in the hours of darkness. Ashcroft's agitation deepened. But how could he gain entry? The locks avail little against patience and cunning, Holmes interrupted. He who leaves such signs is not a bungler. He has the skill of one accustomed to clandestine practice. We deal, I suspect, with a mind both educated and determined. The young barrister sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, while Holmes moved calmly onward, searching each recess for further evidence. On the morrow, Holmes directed his inquiries toward the clerks and attendants of the temple. We encountered them in their offices, where the dust of parchment and the scratch of quills seemed incongruous with the sinister matter in hand. Holmes's manner was one of courtesy, but beneath his politeness there ran that undercurrent of precision which left no detail overlooked. He asked each man, in turn, what he had observed in recent weeks. Strangers loitering, doors found open, unusual deliveries. Their responses were ready enough, yet I fancied more was withheld than disclosed. One young clerk in particular shifted uneasily when Holmes inquired about the late hours he sometimes kept. Another grew red when asked if he had ever left his master's door unguarded. Holmes listened without comment, but his eyes, bright and penetrating, took in every tremor, every hesitation. When we departed, I knew that he had gleaned more from their silences than from their words. It soon became apparent that the statements were far from harmonious. One man insisted that no stranger had passed through the courts. Another swore he had glimpsed a cloaked figure moving swiftly beneath the arches. A third professed ignorance of any disturbance, while a servant contradicted his master's own account of a night spent in chambers. To me, these contradictions were bewildering, but Holmes received them with the faintest curl of his lip. A deliberate. Fog, he said softly, thrown out to obscure the path. Our intruder is known to some here, and they fear to speak plainly. It is often so, Watson. The silence of the guilty and the silence of the intimidated are indistinguishable, save to a trained ear. I marvelled once more at his composure, for the ground beneath us seemed to me no firmer than the foggy streets outside. It was while thus engaged that Holmes made the most remarkable discovery. In the corner of Ashcroft's desk, among discarded drafts, he drew forth a torn fragment of parchment. Upon it, traced in a hurried hand, were the opening words of a Latin sentence, Fiat Justitia. The remainder was broken off, as though the pen had been arrested mid-flow. Holmes studied it intently. "A curious choice," said he. "This is no clerical note, but a phrase plucked from the old legal maxims, Fiat Justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done though the heavens fall. Our adversary has some tincture of legal learning, and takes a certain grim pleasure in displaying it." Ashcroft gazed at the fragment with a shudder. "I know no hand that would use such phrases against me," he said. Holmes slipped the parchment into his pocketbook. Yet here we have the first sure token of personality. Not a mere dagger drawn in soot, but the echo of an educated mind, embittered and reckless. This scrap, Watson, may prove more valuable than a library of testimony. I could not but feel a chill at his words, for they seemed to bring us nearer to the shadowy intellect which haunted our client's life. We were received that afternoon at the imposing residence of Sir Edmund Vale, whose name was already familiar to me through the columns of the financial press. The man himself, when he entered the drawing-room, impressed me at once with the sense of command natural to one accustomed to wielding power in the affairs of commerce. He was tall, broad of shoulder, and carried himself with the easy assurance of one who had battled with many adversaries and prevailed. Yet for all his outward confidence, there was something in the restless shifting of his eyes and the faint compression of his lips which suggested uneasiness. He greeted us with civility, but I fancied that his welcome was tinged with impatience, as though our presence were an intrusion upon business he would rather keep private. Holmes, however, remained entirely composed, bowing with his usual grave courtesy, and at once engaged him in conversation. It was Holmes's way to draw a man into disclosure by the gentlest of prods, and I soon perceived that Sir Edmund was not immune to his art. With a few deft inquiries, my companion turned the talk to Vale's many ventures, from railways in the north to factories along the river. In each undertaking, it appeared, there had been fierce opposition. Rival capitalists had accused him of ruthless dealings, and strikes had broken out amongst his workmen when wages fell short of their expectations. "Surely, Mr. Holmes," he remarked with a half-smile, "a man who prospers in trade must accept enmity as the price of success. If every threat of violence were to be heeded, none of us would sleep." Holmes inclined his head, yet I noted the keen flash of his eyes. He had already discerned that Sir Edmund's enemies were neither few nor powerless, and that such antagonists might easily cloak their malice in the guise of anonymous threats. When Holmes at last broached the matter of the dagger-marked warnings, Sir Edmund dismissed them with a brusque wave of his hand. "Idle scrawls, the work of some discontented fellow who has naught better to do," said he. Yet even as he spoke, I could see the colour ebb slightly from his cheek, and his fingers tightened upon the arm of his chair. Holmes, watching with half-closed lids, pressed him with another question or two, but the magnate grew evasive, declaring that his business affairs were of no concern to outsiders. His voice faltered once, betraying an anxiety that belied his words. I could not help but feel that beneath the veneer of pride there lurked a fear he dared not confess. Ashcroft, seated at my side, grew visibly more distressed at every evasion. Holmes, however, made no sign of disappointment. Indeed, there was a faint curve of satisfaction upon his lips, as though the very concealment served his purpose better than frank confession. As the interview drew to a close, Sir Edmund rose with a firmness that brooked no further inquiry. Holmes thanked him with quiet courtesy, and we withdrew, though I sensed my companion's mind was far from finished with the man. In the hall, as Ashcroft lingered behind to speak with the butler, Holmes turned suddenly and fixed me with a penetrating glance. Not a word passed between us, yet I understood his meaning as plainly as though he had spoken aloud. In that glance lay the acknowledgement that our host's uneasiness was of greater moment than any protestation of indifference. Holmes had read the tremor of the voice, the pallor of the cheek, the nervous twitch of the hand, and in each token he had discovered confirmation of his suspicions. I, for my part, could only marvel at his composure, for my own mind was in turmoil. We had entered to seek clarity. We departed more entangled in mystery than before. That evening found us once more within the familiar walls of Baker Street. The fog had thickened until the lamps outside shone like dim stars, and the rattle of wheels came muffled through the gloom. Holmes, seated by the window, took up his violin, and soon the room was filled with a haunting strain that seemed to echo the very mood of the city. I watched him as his long fingers drew the bow across the strings with languid precision. His eyes were distant, fixed not upon me nor upon the fire, but upon some inward vision which only he beheld. The notes rose and fell like voices in the mist, now plaintive, now insistent, weaving a fabric of sound as enigmatic as the case itself. I knew that when Holmes played thus, it was not in idleness, but as a means of arranging his thoughts. Each sombre chord was the prelude to deduction. For myself, I could not shake the impression left by our visit. The image of Sir Edmund's faltering replies haunted me, and the sight of Ashcroft's anxious countenance weighed heavily upon my mind. The fog pressed against the panes, as if eager to invade our sanctuary, and I fancied it the very emblem of the uncertainty that enveloped us. Holmes had ceased his playing, yet still sat in silence, his features composed in that mask of abstraction which concealed the workings of his intellect. I longed to question him, to draw from him some fragment of his conclusions, but I knew from experience that he would speak only when his chain of reasoning was complete. Thus the night deepened, the fire burned low, and the city lay smothered beneath its pall. I closed my journal with a sense that we were moving, step by inexorable step, toward a peril as yet unseen but none the less certain. The next day broke with a grim revelation. I had scarcely settled with my breakfast when Holmes silently laid before me the Morning Chronicle. Across its columns, in heavy print, ran the announcement of a most shocking crime. A night watchman had been discovered murdered at one of Sir Edmund Vale's warehouses upon the riverfront. The body, so the report declared, bore no mark save a single fatal wound, but upon the wall beside it was found the crude scrawl of a dagger, traced in soot. The article, written with all the exaggeration beloved of the press, dwelt upon the mystery with unseemly relish. It spoke of dark conspiracies, of secret societies bent upon revenge, and hinted even at the possibility of anarchist plots. I laid the paper down with a shudder, for I could not fail to connect the crime with the threats that had so tormented young Ashcroft. Holmes, meanwhile, smoked thoughtfully, his eyes half closed. "Our adversary grows bolder," he remarked at last. "The play has passed from whisper to blow. We must waste no time." And with that, the day's course was fixed. We were soon conveyed eastward, the carriage rolling through the thick fog that seemed to brood over every alley and wharf. The river, when we reached it, was but a dull, gleaming ribbon choked in mist. The warehouses, rising like sombre fortresses from the bank, presented a grim aspect even in the best of weather. Beneath that suffocating pall, they seemed positively funereal. Not a sound disturbed the stillness save the faint lap of water against stone and the distant moan of a foghorn. The few figures we passed moved with hurried steps, their outlines blurred until they seemed shadows more than men. Holmes sat erect, his gaze fixed upon the obscured outlines ahead, and uttered not a word. I confess the silence and gloom weighed upon me heavily. There was a sense of menace in the very air, as though the city itself conspired with the murderer to conceal his hand. At length, our carriage drew up before the warehouse, where a knot of constables and idlers had gathered. We descended, and I steeled myself for the sight that awaited us within. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit by lanterns, their glow half strangled by the fog which seeped even into that cavernous space. There, against the brick wall, lay the body of the unfortunate watchman. He was a man of middle years, plainly attired, his features still fixed in the rigidity of sudden death. Holmes bent low without hesitation, while I, as a physician, could not but note the clean wound upon the chest. A thrust swift and sure, delivered by one who understood the use of a blade. Yet it was not the body alone that struck chill to my heart. Beside it, drawn coarsely in black soot, was the familiar outline of a dagger. The crude symbol, so often traced upon Ashcroft's warnings, now marked its dreadful signature upon the wall of death. A murmur of awe passed among the onlookers. To me, it seemed an open challenge, as though the murderer exulted in his impunity. Ashcroft, who had accompanied us, turned deathly pale, and I feared he might collapse. Holmes, however, betrayed no emotion. His eyes passed coolly from the corpse to the sign upon the wall, and thence to the floor, where faint traces awaited his scrutiny. His calmness at such a sight seemed almost inhuman. While the inspector in charge directed his men with loud orders, Holmes moved apart, his attention fixed upon the minutiae which escaped every other eye. He stooped to examine a faint smudge upon the boards, traced with his lens the outline of a half-obliterated footprint, and gathered between finger and thumb a pinch of black dust which he stored carefully in his pocketbook. Not a word escaped him during this process. His face bore that mask of abstraction which I had so often seen when the working of his mind was at its height. To the casual eye he might have seemed indifferent. To me, who knew him well, each silent gesture was eloquent of intense concentration. I longed to question him, to demand some glimmer of his conclusions, but he would not be hurried. "Patience, Watson," was all he whispered once, before returning to his search. And so we waited, conscious that his silence meant more than 1,000 words. By afternoon, the crime was upon every tongue. Fresh placards blazoned sensational headlines, and knots of citizens gathered at street corners, whispering in alarm. The dagger symbol, repeated in crude sketches upon the sheets, became the subject of fearful conjecture. Some saw in it the mark of a secret brotherhood. Others spoke of foreign assassins hired to strike at England's trade. Crowds pressed to the riverfront, eager for a glimpse of the warehouse where the murder had occurred. The air was thick with rumour and invention, while the papers, eager for circulation, fed the frenzy with reckless speculation. I could not but feel the gravity of the matter increase tenfold. What had begun with furtive notes now stood revealed in blood, and the whole city seemed trembling on the edge of panic. That night, back in Baker Street, Holmes was more silent than I had ever known him. He sat long by the fire, his chin upon his hands, the violin lying idle upon the table. His eyes burned with an inward light, but his lips uttered nothing. I ventured at last to press him, but he raised his hand with a gesture of warning. "The threads are yet too tangled, Watson," said he. "Speak too soon, and they will break. Leave me to my thoughts." So I watched in quiet, disturbed by the strange detachment which held him. It was as though he were groping through a labyrinth of shadow, where each turn led deeper into obscurity. His very silence filled me with unease, for I knew that in Holmes's world, such silence was but the prelude to some great revelation, or to danger beyond imagining. The true climax of that dreadful day came with nightfall. A messenger arrived in frantic haste, bearing word from Ashcroft's household. His sister, Miss Evelyn, had discovered upon her very pillow a note. It bore no words, save the familiar dagger symbol, drawn boldly in black across the page. The intrusion was as audacious as it was sinister. To place such a token in the chamber of a lady was proof that the hand which guided this campaign of terror was growing reckless with triumph. The household was in uproar. Miss Ashcroft was near collapse, and her brother scarcely master of himself. Holmes received the tidings with composure, yet I saw his features harden. "The noose tightens, Watson," said he. "Our adversary overplays his hand. It is in his rashness that we shall find his undoing." I felt then that the shadow of peril had fallen directly upon us all. When at last Holmes broke his silence, it was with that calm authority which bespoke the certainty of a mind that had reached its conclusion. He spread before me upon the table the fragments we had gathered, the sooty smudges from the warehouse floor, the candle wax from the temple window, the crude symbols traced upon the notes, and the scrap of parchment inscribed with its half-remembered Latin. "Consider them together, Watson," said he. "Do they not form the outline of a personality? Here we have the wax and soot, the tokens of stealthy nocturnal excursions. Here the dagger sign, repeated obsessively until it becomes less a threat than a signature. And here the Latin, the flourish of a man whose mind has once been sharpened upon the grindstone of legal study." I nodded, for the chain of reasoning seemed already plain. Holmes's eyes shone with that gleam which ever accompanied discovery. "Our adversary," he continued, "is no common ruffian. He is a man of education, reduced perhaps by circumstance, yet driven by an obsession which has darkened into monomania. His blows are delivered not for profit, but for passion. Such an enemy is formidable, yet not beyond our reach." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Note, Watson, the curious mixture of order and frenzy. The dagger, scrawled with almost childish roughness, is not the work of a careless hand, but of one compelled by inner necessity. The soot and damp cloak tell of method. The intruder moves silently, prepared for concealment, and leaves as little trace as he may. And the Latin fragment, there we glimpse vanity. It is the pride of an educated man who cannot resist flaunting his superiority even in crime." "Then," I asked, "we confront one whose intellect is at war with his passions." "Precisely. He is logical enough to devise a scheme of terror, yet ungoverned in the very impulse that drives him. Such contradictions make him dangerous, but they also render him vulnerable, for passion will ever betray itself. The steady hand of calculation falters when the heart is inflamed." I marvelled once more at the subtlety of Holmes's deductions. To me, these scattered tokens had seemed mere curiosities. To him, they were the tracings of a human soul, laid bare as plainly as though the culprit had confessed in person. "Now," Holmes resumed, "if we are to lay hands upon this adversary, we must compel him to betray himself. It will not serve to watch and wait, for he thrives upon secrecy. We must therefore force his hand, by making him believe his design imperiled." He spoke with quiet conviction, outlining the stratagem with the precision of a general. The adversary would be led to suppose that his writings, his very identity, had been traced, and that exposure was imminent. In his desperation to avert discovery, he would strike one final blow. It was upon that blow that Holmes meant to stand ready. Ashcroft, pale but resolute, assented to the part required of him. The police, under Lestrade's direction, were to hold themselves in readiness. Holmes himself would take the central role, offering his own person as the lure. "You see, Watson," said he, "the trap must not appear a trap. It must wear the semblance of opportunity, so that the guilty hand is drawn to act. Only then shall we close the net." Within the next day, a rumour, carefully instigated by Holmes, found its way into discreet channels. It was whispered that certain papers had been secured from the temple, papers containing matter of grave import, and now held under guard at Sir Edmund Vale's estate. The tale was carried with just enough verisimilitude to reach the ears for which it was intended. Holmes watched its dissemination with an impassive face, yet I could read the vigilance beneath his calm. "If our adversary is half as desperate as I judge," he murmured, "this news will sting him into action. He will risk all to seize what he believes his own destruction." Thus the stage was set, though as yet no actor had stepped forth. We awaited only the fall of darkness and the thick veil of fog which London so seldom denied us. That evening I found myself stationed in a narrow doorway, concealed by the shadows, my eyes straining into the gloom. The fog hung dense, rolling in slow wreaths that muffled every sound and transformed the gas lamps into pale ghosts. My heart beat more quickly than I should care to confess, for I knew that at any instant violence might erupt from the shroud about us. Holmes had entrusted me with but a single instruction: to remain watchful and to intervene only upon his signal. The simplicity of the task did not lessen its weight, for my anxiety for his safety was heavy indeed. I knew too well his habit of exposing himself in order to flush out his quarry, and I feared lest this time his daring overpassed prudence. Yet my loyalty was firm. Whatever danger might come, I resolved that I should stand by him, though the night conceal a dozen enemies. Further along the street, though hidden from common sight, Lestrade and his men lay in wait. Their boots were muffled, their lanterns extinguished, each man crouched in the recesses of doorways and alleys. The inspector himself moved like a shadow among them, whispering instructions with suppressed excitement. I confess I took some comfort from their presence, though I doubted whether even a score of officers could anticipate every move of such an adversary. Still, the silent line of watchers gave assurance that when the moment came, Holmes would not stand alone. And so we waited, the police with their handcuffs ready, I with my revolver close at hand, all our senses strained upon the fog in expectation of the figure that must emerge. Amid this tense stillness, Holmes stood forth, solitary and unflinching. His tall figure, faintly illumined by a distant lamp, loomed spectral through the vapour. He had chosen his station with care, placing himself as though by chance in the very path which the adversary must take. Never had I so keenly felt the peril of his profession. To see him thus, a single man pitted against an unseen foe, stirred within me both pride and dread. He neither moved nor spoke, but his posture bespoke vigilance, and his very stillness seemed a challenge flung into the night. The fog thickened, shifting in ghostly swirls, until at moments he vanished altogether, then reappeared like an apparition. Each minute stretched intolerably, my nerves taut with suspense, and then, as though conjured from the mist itself, a shadow began to steal forward, silent and sinister, drawn inevitably toward the waiting figure of my friend. The fog had drawn closer about us, thick as a curtain, when at last a movement caught my straining eyes. Out of the shifting vapour, dim as a wraith, there came a figure, cautious yet resolute, advancing with the stealth of one accustomed to secrecy. Each step was measured, as though the intruder feared detection, and yet compelled by a force stronger than prudence. My heart quickened, for I knew we were at the moment upon which all hinged. Holmes stood immovable, a solitary sentinel in the mist, his figure faintly limned by the paling light of a distant lamp. The advancing shadow paused once, craned his head as though listening, then came on again, the folds of his cloak brushing the stones with a sinister whisper. I felt the grip of suspense tighten upon me. Each swirl of vapour seemed alive with menace, each silence fraught with the imminence of violence. The trap had been laid, and at last the prey was drawn into it. Holmes did not stir, but I saw his head incline ever so slightly, the signal that he too had marked the approach of the figure now stealing towards him through the fog. The figure halted within a few yards of Holmes, and for an instant there was no sound but the faint stir of the river breeze. Then my friend's voice rang out, calm and cutting as steel. "You had best spare yourself further trouble, Mr. Percival Green." At that name the man started back, and I, peering through the gloom, discerned the pale, sharp features of Sir Edmund Vale's secretary. Never had I received a greater shock. Green had seemed to me but a discreet functionary, silent and efficient, devoted to his master's affairs. Yet here he stood, caught like a moth in the web Holmes had spun, his countenance distorted by guilt and fear. "You are discovered," Holmes continued, his tone unwavering. "The dagger signs, the wax, the soot, the Latin fragments, each pointed to you. You have played your part with skill, but passion betrays what craft conceals. Green's lips moved soundlessly, then twisted into a snarl. He clutched at his breast as though the words had struck him there. The duplicity of months was stripped away in that instant, leaving exposed not the secretary of sober repute, but a man consumed by darker fires. What followed was less a confession than an outpouring, wrung from a soul inflamed by jealousy. Green's voice, tremulous yet vehement, rose in the mist. "Yes, it was I," he cried. "I who endured years of drudgery at Vale's side, my talents unmarked, my devotion repaid with scorn. And she, Evelyn Ashcroft, she passed me by, with no more thought than for a servant. Yet I loved her with a fire that burned me to the bone, while she gave her hand to that pompous tyrant who ground men to dust beneath his wheels of commerce." His breast heaved, his eyes gleamed with a fevered light. Was it not just that I should strike terror into them, that I should make him tremble, and her see what it meant to spurn the one who would have cherished her? The dagger was my mark, the sign of the justice I would deal. His words fell hot and wild, the naked revelation of a heart warped by passion. I felt a pang of pity amid my horror, for here was not a criminal of calculation only, but a man undone by the very strength of his own misguided love. But confession soon gave way to frenzy. With a hoarse cry, Green tore open his cloak and produced a long knife whose blade caught the faint gleam of the lanterns. His eyes darted to Holmes, and in them I read the desperation of one resolved to silence forever the man who had unmasked him. "Then take the reward of your meddling," he shouted, and rushed forward. I started from my concealment, but Holmes neither flinched nor retreated. He stood poised, watchful, every nerve prepared for the assault. In another instant the knife would have struck, had not the signal been given. From either side there came the rush of feet as Lestrade and his men sprang from their hiding places. I, too, dashed forward, revolver in hand, my mind filled with dread for my friend. The fog thickened about us, the forms half seen, the clash of struggle muffled in the mist. Yet above it all I heard Holmes's voice, cool and firm, directing the movements as though master even of that chaos. The fight was joined, and the moment of greatest peril was upon us. The struggle that ensued was one of the most desperate I have ever witnessed. Green, with the strength of a madman, fought like a beast at bay. His knife flashed in the gloom, striking sparks from the cobbles as he slashed at those who closed upon him. 2 constables staggered back, narrowly escaping death. The fog lent a ghostly unreality to the scene. At one moment I glimpsed Holmes grappling with the assailant, at another only the swirl of vapour where the men had vanished. Shouts, the sound of blows, the gasping of straining lungs, all rose and fell in that spectral theatre. It was my hand, with another officer's, that at last seized Green's wrist and forced the knife to the ground. Even then he writhed with extraordinary fury, cursing Vale's name and calling vainly for Evelyn. The strength of 6 men was needed before the handcuffs closed upon him. When the clamour subsided, there lay Percival Green, panting and dishevelled, his eyes still burning with the wild light of obsession. The dagger clattered harmlessly upon the stones, and the fog closed in once more, as though to shroud the shame of that violent scene. With the prisoner secured, a hush fell upon the street. The fog swirled about us still, but in my mind it seemed less impenetrable, as though a weight had lifted with the villain's capture. Holmes stood erect, his features calm, though I saw upon his sleeve the trace of a struggle, and in his eyes the stern light of triumph. "Observe, Watson," said he quietly, "how the fog without mirrors the fog within a man's heart. It is not industry, nor politics, nor commerce that breeds the darkest perils, but passions ungoverned. Green's education armed him with skill, yet it was jealousy that guided his hand. Thus, intellect became the servant of madness." I pondered his words, shaken by the peril we had so narrowly escaped. Ashcroft, who had watched in silent horror, now bent his head in gratitude and grief alike, for the revelation of such obsession struck deeply. The constables led Green away. his struggle subsiding into mutterings of Evelyn's name. As the sound of footsteps died in the fog, I felt the chill of the night yield at last to a faint stirring of dawn. The shadows, though still dense, had begun to part, and with them, the mystery drew nearer to its close. With Green safely in custody and the fog beginning to lift from the streets, we returned at last to Baker Street. The familiar sight of our lodgings, with the fire glowing steadily and Mrs. Hudson bustling below, brought a sense of repose after the violence we had endured. For my part, I confess that the memory of that knife flashing in the mist still lingered unpleasantly before my eyes, and the sound of Green's frenzied cries rang in my ears. Holmes, however, appeared untouched by fatigue. He removed his coat, took his accustomed place by the hearth, and at once drew from his pocket the various fragments of evidence we had collected. His manner was one of quiet satisfaction, but there was no triumph in it. To him, the night's events were but the logical conclusion of a process already complete in his mind. Holmes held up a small scrap of hardened substance in the light. "Here, Watson, lies our first token, candle wax, found upon the sill of Ashcroft's chambers. To most eyes it was a trifling stain, to mine, the mark of deliberate surveillance. A candle so placed would cast its light outward, enabling an observer to peer within without being himself discovered. It told me at once that our enemy was not content with threats. He must also watch, measure, and plan." He leaned back, his eyes gleaming. Green was well positioned for such vigilance. His duties as Vale's secretary afforded him both opportunity and excuse to linger near the temple. That faint trace of wax betrayed nights of secret observation. The hand that leaves so small a token often leaves a greater crime behind. From that moment, I knew we confronted a watcher as well as a writer. Holmes next produced a paper containing the black residue he had scraped from the boards. "This soot," said he, "was no ordinary dust of the hearth. It was deposited by a cloak brushed across the floor, damp with the night air and tinged with the odour of the river. Its presence in Ashcroft's chambers proved beyond question that a nocturnal visitor had intruded there." I asked whether such a sign might not have been left by accident. Holmes shook his head with decision. The pattern was too distinct, a streak low upon the boards, where only the hem of a long garment would touch. It told me our intruder was a man accustomed to the night, concealing himself in the fog, and careful enough to leave by stealth. The soot reappeared later at Vale's warehouse, linking both scenes with the same hand. When the watchman lay slain, the mark was there also. It was Green who passed thus, cloaked and silent, leaving behind him the black trail that betrayed his course. I marvelled once again how a smear of dust, unheeded by others, could become in Holmes's hands the key to a life and death puzzle. Holmes then drew from his pocketbook the torn scrap of parchment. This, Watson, was the most telling of all. The half-written phrase fiat justitia is no idle flourish. It is the echo of legal training, the pride of a mind that once sought to distinguish itself in study. Green, before entering Vale's service, had indeed attended the Inns of Court, though he had failed to secure advancement. The fragment was the careless token of a man whose vanity compelled him to scatter erudition, even in crime. Holmes's voice grew reflective. The Latin connected him not merely to education, but to resentment. Such phrases are weapons of those who feel themselves overlooked. Green would remind himself, and others if they could but understand, that he was more than a secretary. Thus, the dagger became not only his mark of terror, but the parchment his mark of intellect. Together they formed a pattern unmistakable. He placed the scrap gently upon the table. In crime, Watson, men rarely escape the impress of their true selves. They leave behind some fragment of character. Here a smudge of soot, there a scrap of Latin. To the trained eye, such fragments weave the man entire. Yet all these tokens, Holmes continued, would have remained but curiosities had I not discerned the motive that bound them. It was not commerce, nor political rivalry, that impelled Green. His hatred of Vale sprang from a deeper well: jealousy. He coveted Evelyn Ashcroft, and when she gave her hand elsewhere, his mind, already embittered, was consumed by passion. Holmes spoke with a stern gravity. Jealousy, Watson, is among the most potent of motives, for it is irrational and inexhaustible. Green could endure neglect in business, contempt in society, even obscurity in his career. But the thought that she, whom he idolized, had chosen another, unseated his reason. The dagger became to him a symbol, not of profit, but of vengeance, to terrify and to punish. The murder of the watchman was but an accident in his campaign, a blow struck to silence one who had surprised him. I could not but shudder at the thought of a man's life extinguished by such ungoverned desire. The threads of the case, so dark and tangled, were now beginning to form themselves into a single web, spun by the hand of obsession. Holmes rose and paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Mark it well, Watson. It is not the rivalries of commerce, nor the hatreds of politics, that most endanger us. These are but contests of interest. The true peril lies in the passions of the heart. They strike without reason, and their force is beyond calculation. Green was no common villain. He was a man warped by his own affections, his intellect pressed into the service of a diseased longing. He paused before the window, where the first pale light of morning was struggling through the fog. Consider how many crimes are rooted not in necessity, but in the storm of human emotion: jealousy, envy, greed, and desire. They arm the hand more surely than gold or vengeance. It is these, Watson, that I fear most. For against the intrigues of statesmen or the plots of industrial rivals, one may contend with reason. But against the tempest of a man's heart, reason is powerless. I wrote these words even as he spoke them, for I felt they were among the most solemn utterances I had ever heard from his lips. They remain with me still. It was with no small sense of relief that I beheld the morning light stealing across Baker Street, dispersing the heavy vapours which had so long enveloped the city. The lamps, that only hours before had burned dimly in the mist, now paled before the growing radiance of dawn. The roofs and chimneys, blurred and uncertain the previous night, stood out once more in firm outline against the brightening sky. It seemed to me that London itself was drawing a breath of liberation, freed from the menace which had weighed upon it. From my window I watched the fog rise in ragged wisps, curling away as though reluctant to surrender its dominion. The case which had begun under its sinister shroud had reached its conclusion with its lifting, and as the city returned to its familiar life, the clatter of carts, the cries of vendors, the bustle of clerks, I felt a corresponding release within my own breast. The shadow of fear was gone, though its memory would long remain. Holmes, meanwhile, exhibited none of the outward elation which I, in my relief, had expected. He reclined in his chair, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed not upon the busy street below, but upon the fire which smouldered quietly in the grate. His features, calm and austere, betrayed little beyond the faintest trace of fatigue. It was in such moments, when silence reigned, that I most clearly perceived the gravity which underlay his brilliant exterior. He bore not merely the triumph of detection, but the weight of all its revelations. Where others might rejoice in a capture, Holmes reserved his energies for reflection. To him, each case was less a victory over crime than an inquiry into the dark recesses of human motive. And so he sat, the very image of composure, as if the storm that had raged about us had left no mark upon his spirit. At length he stirred, and his voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate. It is curious, Watson, how swiftly men will attribute danger to the vast engines of our age. They speak of industry, of politics, of commerce, as though the shadows that threaten society issue solely from its structures. Yet in truth, these are but the stage upon which the drama is enacted. The true menace does not arise from factories or parliaments, but from the hearts that govern them. He turned his gaze upon me, his eyes alight with that cool lucidity which never failed to impress me. Consider Sir Edmund Vale. He was surrounded by rivals, men embittered by his success, workers estranged by his policies. It would have been natural to suppose that from such quarters the danger must come. Yet the hand which struck was not that of an industrial opponent, but of one who stood daily at his side. Shadows, Watson, do not fall only from smokestacks. They fall also from the silent mind that broods upon its own injustice. I could not but acknowledge the truth of his words. So aptly had the case itself furnished their proof. Holmes resumed, his tone still restrained, yet carrying with it a weight that impressed itself upon me deeply. It is not the shadow of industry, nor the smog of our century that imperils us most, but the fog of the human heart. Jealousy, obsession, secrecy. These are the true vapours that obscure reason and breed calamity. Green, by education and capacity, might have lived a useful life. Yet the cloud within him grew so dense that no light could penetrate. Thus, what should have been loyalty turned to envy, and devotion twisted into vengeance. He paused, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe. The lesson is clear, my dear Watson. We may strive to regulate factories, to legislate against poverty, to guard against foreign intrigue, but no statute can govern the passions that lie hidden in men's breasts. Until those are tamed, society will ever be vulnerable to sudden storms, more destructive than any calamity wrought by industry or state. I wrote his words in my notes that very morning, for I recognized them as among the most profound reflections I had ever heard from his lips. For my own part, I could not repress a certain melancholy when I considered the fate of Percival Green. His mind, though warped, bore the marks of talent. His heart, though misguided, had once been capable of noble devotion. Had fortune smiled differently upon him, had his passion been governed by reason or returned with kindness, he might have stood in society as a man of worth. Instead, jealousy consumed him, until all that remained was the shadow of an intellect enslaved to madness. I felt pity for Evelyn Ashcroft, upon whom his disordered affection had fallen, but pity also for the man himself, who had squandered his life in a futile struggle with his own desires. It is ever thus, I reflected, that crime leaves behind not only victims, but wasted human potential, the saddest wreckage of all. Thus, the case was ended. Holmes and I sat together in the quiet of our sitting room, the fog now entirely dispersed, the city stirring to its daily round. The fire burned low upon the hearth, casting a gentle glow upon his thoughtful features. Outside, the sun touched the rooftops, gilding them in the freshness of morning. I closed my journal, conscious that once again I had been privileged to witness both the brilliance of my friend and the frailty of human nature. And so, with London awakened, the curtain fell softly upon our vigil in Baker Street. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting upon the embers in the grate. You see, Watson, it was not the soot, nor the wax, nor even the dagger mark that most betrayed our adversary. It was his heart. Logic may be concealed for a time, but passion will ever break through its disguise. Jealousy, ungoverned, is the most dangerous fog of all, for it blinds a man to truth and leads him to his ruin. I made no reply, struck by the weight of his words. The silence lingered, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. And so I turn to you. What do you think was Percival Green's greatest mistake? Was it leaving traces of his education behind, or surrendering to the jealous obsession that consumed him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mystery, I invite you to share it with others who love Holmes's adventures. Subscribe for more tales, and join us again when the next case beckons from the fog.